Podfaded or inactive shows are seen as a drain on podcasting by some, cluttering up indices and frustrating listeners. But in reality, they could be used as a material resource for podcast growth. Hello and welcome to another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. Can you breathe life back into a podfaded or inactive show? Or better yet, can you use that podfaded or inactive show of yours as a power source for something else? Now, there are all sorts of reasons why you may have a podfaded or an inactive show. I know I have a lot of podfaded and inactive shows that are still in a hosting account of mine somewhere, right? Maybe for you, you have an unlimited hosting plan. So, unlimited hosting plan means you make a new show up all the time, whatever. Or maybe you're on a free hosting plan and that podfaded show is still there, you just haven't logged in a very long time. Or whatever it is, the expense, if it does cost something, because look, it doesn't cost a lot of money to host a podcast. Maybe you put it on a lower tier or whatever. It's just not a big enough expense for you to take action on. So it's still there, which means some or all of the files, the audio files of that show that you may not have touched in years are still on a hosting provider somewhere. The RSS feed is still connected to the various apps and directories, which means even though they haven't seen it in a long time, some people, some devices at least, are probably still following or are subscribed to that feed. Because what I have seen in my years of doing this is that many people, I'll go with most people, don't bother to unfollow or unsubscribe from a podcast when that show stops sending out new episodes. I know that you do, I do, but most people do not. That's out of sight, out of mind. Now, back to you for a moment. There are all sorts of reasons why you might want to reactivate or unfade a podfaded show. Maybe it's to start it up again. Maybe there's enough activity there, and we'll talk about that in a second, to where it's time for you to get back into that thing. The reason it's on hiatus is because you said, I'm going to get back to it, and maybe it's time to do that. Okay. Maybe, though, it's time for you to change that show. Maybe change the focus and direction, the topic, whatever, and turn around and relaunch it. Or, as mentioned previously, you could use that podfaded show as a power source to drive traffic to another podcast or another property. Okay, you can do all of those things, but are any of them worth the effort? That's what stops most people from reactivating or doing something with their podfaded show. That's the question. What's the effort? Is the effort worth it? Because we really don't know how many people are subscribed or follow the feed. We don't. And sure, we can get some follower/subscriber data from like Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Podcasts. They give some of that data, but that means the show already had to be in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if it wasn't, if you didn't set your account up, you may not have any of that data. It just might not be there. The history may not be there. There's also the fact that even if you can get the data, you're failing to capture the long tail. The long tail of other apps people might have used to listen to your show, not Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and or Google Podcasts. And all of those long tail subscribers, followers add up. So here's what you can do. Drop an episode into that faded show. Just drop an episode of something into that faded show and count the number of downloads it gets, but only over the first few days. That's all you're looking for. It's a test to find out if there are still people connected, if there are still devices connected that will automatically download that content. That's important. I mean, the episode, again, can be whatever. We don't really care. Maybe it's a new file where you just go tap, tap, tap. Is this thing on? Or something along those lines. Or maybe even a lower effort than that. If you've got a promo that's handy for a show you're producing, drop that in there. All you're trying to do is find out how many devices are connected and how many people will quickly click, say, ooh, something new from this show I haven't heard for a long time. Just do a count. And once you've done that count, if those numbers of downloads suddenly look attractive to you, whether it's dozens or hundreds or thousands in some case, it might be worth the effort to do something. Maybe relaunch, of course, you could do that, or maybe redirect those subscribers to a new or active show, or just a different show. Yeah, use it as a power source. They're there, subscribed. Give them the new show. Move them to the new show. Now, a couple of caveats before you run out and do this immediately. Look, I'm not about to redirect my defunct travel/comedy podcast over to Podcast Pontifications. It's a bad fit. I try and be a little funny here on the show, but it's just not what it was designed for. So do not do that. Make sure that there's a fit. The second caveat, though, is that just doing the test will cause some people to unfollow/unsubscribe from that show they thought was dead. You can't change that from happening. You can try with making really great content, but look, just like you and I both unsubscribed from a crazy number of retailers from Black Friday that we haven't heard from in an entire year, same thing's going to happen to us. But that's okay. That's okay. We're going to get the majority of the people won't do that. They'll just simply swipe it or delete it or whatever and move on. You'll get the majority of them over to the new show. Or maybe, again, the size of that audience was big enough to where now you're motivated to breathe new life into that Podfaded show. Or maybe you can sell it. I don't really care. It's totally up to you. Ask your podcasting friends if they have any Podfaded shows. I bet they do in their hosting account. And maybe see if they're interested in doing this as a test. Collaborate together. Go ahead and share this episode with them. This will explain the concept to them, and maybe it's something you can collaborate on and go forward. And obviously, if you like this idea, go, wow, that was cool, Evo. Head to buymeacoffee.com/Evo Terra and slide a virtual coffee my way. Next week is May in 2021, at least by the day I'm recording this. That means it's only a month away before I take roughly a 6-week break before bringing you Season 4 of Podcast Pontifications. I'm going to be reaching out to every single one of you who has graciously bought me a coffee over the years and talk about some opportunities for you and Podcast Pontifications you might want to be a part of. So keep your eye on that. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. No episodes from me on Friday, so enjoy your weekend. Think about reactivating these shows or using them to power something new you're doing. And I shall be back not tomorrow, but on Monday, yes, with another Podcast Pontifications. Cheers.